All right, Algebra 2B, here is your practice quiz. Okay, so we have cosine theta equals 5/13. Let's find sine, and we are in quadrant 1. 0 to 90, quadrant 1. That means cosine's positive, that means sine is positive. All right, cosine to sine, we're probably using our first one there. Sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. You might have rearranged it for sine already, that's fine. So we have sine squared plus 5/13 squared. 5/13 squared, we got 25 over 169. We're going to change this 1 to 169 over 169. Subtract that over 144 over 169. Square root. Sine equals 12/13. Okay. Double check what quadrant. We're in quadrant 1, so sine is positive. That is right. Check quadrants. Number 2, if tangent equals 4, find secant. Find secant. All right, we have a formula for that. Tan squared plus 1 equals secant squared. Okay, so we got 4 squared plus 1. 16 plus 1, we're going to have 17. Square root equals secant. Okay, now, secant is related to cosine. We're in quadrant 1. Cosine's positive. Remember, cosine is the x-coordinate here. It's the first one. So positive, so secant's going to be positive as well. We're good. Okay, next set of problems. We are in quadrant 3. Oopsies. We're down here in quadrant 3, 180 to 270. Okay, so that means we're negative, comma, negative. Cosine is negative, sine is negative. If cosecant is negative 3/2, find cotangent. So we have cotangent squared plus 1 equals cosecant squared. We'll rearrange that. Cotangent squared is going to equal cosecant, the other way around. 1, no, it's cosecant squared minus 1. So we got negative 3/2 squared. That's going to be 9/4 minus 4/4. Change your 1 to 4/4. Okay, and we'll have 5/4. Square root. Okay, I can't do the square root of 5, so we leave that. I can do the square root of 4, it's 2. Okay, now we got to think. Quadrant check. We're in quadrant 3. Cosine is negative, sine is negative. Cotangent is cosine over sine, so that'd be a negative divided by a negative, which would be a positive, so we're good with our positive radical 5/2. If secant equals negative 3, find tangent. And again, there's a formula for that. They've been pretty nice to us here so far. Tan squared plus 1 equals secant squared. So tangent squared is equal to secant squared minus 1. That's negative 3 squared minus 1. 9, positive 9, minus 1 is 8. Okay, square root. Tangent equals radical 8. Reduce your radical. Should be 2 radical 2. Quadrant 3, we just said negative, negative. All right, but just like with cotangent, tangent is sine over cosine, so negative divided by negative is a positive. One more of these type problems, one more section. 270 to 360, that's quadrant 4. So we're positive for cosine, negative for sine. If cosine equals 3/10, find cotangent. Lots of opportunities here, okay? There is not a direct cosine to cotangent one. So we can do cosine and get sine and then kind of manually come up with cotangent. We could flip cosine to secant, do the secant to tangent formula, and then flip that answer to cotangent. A lot of opportunities or options here available to us. I'm going to go with the formula route here. I'm going to go with, if cosine is 3/10, then secant equals 10/3. Tangent squared equals secant squared plus, minus 1. Minus 1. So we've got 10/3 squared minus 1. 100/9 minus 9/9. Okay. So tangent squared equals 91/9. All right. Next, square root. Tan squared equals 91/9. We're going to square root. So tangent equals the square root of 91. Not much I can do with that. The square root of 9 is 3. We want cotangent, so we flip it. Ooh, this is a fun one. Fix it. 3 radical 91 over 91. Quadrant check. Cosine is positive, sine is negative. So if I do positive cosine divided by negative sine, this should be negative. So Q4 means we are negative 3 radical 91 over 91. Oh man, that had a lot going on. That had a lot going on. Okay, number 5 over here is going to be pretty similar. Pretty similar. Tangent equals negative 1/2. Find sine. Find sine. Okay. So you got the same kind of options here. Tangent's negative 1/2. Maybe you want to flip that to cotangent. And then use your cotangent formula to find cosecant and flip it. Or we could use the tangent formula, get secant, flip that to cosine, flip, and then solve for sine. Up to you. I think the shortest route here is, let's call this tangent. We're going to flip that to cotangent. It would be negative 2. Okay. Cotangent squared plus 1 equals cosecant squared. Cosecant is partners with sine, so that's helpful here. We're on the right path. Negative 2 squared plus 1 is, negative 2 squared is positive 4, plus 1 is 5. Square roots. Radical 5 equals cosecant. Flip it. 1 over radical 5 equals sine. Okay, can't have radical 5 on the bottom, so that's radical 5 over regular 5 multiplied by radical 5, top and bottom, equals sine. Quadrant check, quadrant 4. Cosine is positive, sine is negative. So Q4 means we have negative per sine. Negative radical 5 over 5. Whew! Okay, so those quadrant ones can be tough. Those first 4 were pretty straightforward. The second 2, or the last 2, you kind of had to think a little bit. Might have to do more than one formula. Okay, 6 cosecant times tangent, and we're just simplifying. So cosecant is 1 over sine, times tangent is sine over cosine. So the sines cancel out. We have 1 over cosine, which is secant. Same idea over here with 7. Sine squared times cotangent squared. Well, cotangent squared is cosine squared over sine squared. Sine squareds cancel out. And all we have left is the cosine squared on the top. Backside, still simplifying. Cosecant squared minus cotangent squared over 1 minus cosine squared. Okay, so cosecant squared minus cotangent squared. If I subtract the cotangent squared over cosecant squared minus cotangent squared, would equal 1. So my top would be 1. 1 minus cosine squared would be sine squared. 1 over sine squared equals cosecant squared. Piece of cake. All right, now we're starting to get into some stuff where we got to think a little bit and do something here. Sine plus cosine times cotangent. Sine plus cosine times cosine over sine. So that is sine plus cosine squared over sine. Well, I'd like to be able to add these together, so we would need a common denominator. So let me multiply this one by sine over sine. So now I have sine squared over sine plus cosine squared over sine. Okay, common denominator, I can put them together. What's sine squared plus cosine squared? 1. 1 over sine equals cosecant. All right. So the simplifying ones, there's not a whole lot of direction. You just got to keep going until we get down to like one thing. Or sometimes it's like 2 things, but usually just one thing. Okay, the verify, I think those are a little easier because you have some direction on where you're going. Sine squared plus cosine squared over cosine squared equals secant squared. Well, this side looks the most complicated, so let's start there. Sine squared plus cosine squared, that's 1. Oh, easy stuff. And 1 over cosine squared is secant squared. The end. Too easy. 1 plus sine times 1 minus sine, that's an equals there, and that's not showing up, equals cosine squared. I think we did one like this for the homework. All right, let's FOIL this out. Minus sine plus sine minus sine squared. So we have minus sine and plus sine cancel. 1 minus sine squared. 1 minus sine squared is cosine squared. And there we are. We made it. So far, pretty easy. 1 step, 2 step. All right, this last one's going to have a little bit more work. This last one's going to have a little bit more work. And depending on what the time is on the video after this one, I might show you both ways, or I might just stick with one. Okay, cosine squared times cotangent squared equals cotangent squared minus cosine squared. Well, both sides are about equally awful, so let's go with the right side first. Let's go with the right side first. I'll write it down twice. I think we also did something very similar to this one in class. Might have been a homework problem somebody asked about. Okay, so I'm going to go with the cotangent squared minus cosine squared. We're going to change this to cosine squared over sine squared minus cosine squared. Okay, I'm seeing those two things. I'd like to put them together. Seeing is that the left-hand side isn't separated. The left-hand side is this multiplication. They're not separated out. So I'd like to try to get these together if I can. So that means I want a common denominator. Multiply the top and bottom by sine squared. So now we have cosine squared minus cosine squared times sine squared all over sine squared. You'll notice that both pieces have a cosine squared, so let's factor that out in front. Cosine squared times 1 minus sine squared over sine squared. 1 minus sine squared is another cosine squared. Okay, and let's separate this out into two fractions. Cosine squared over 1 times cosine squared over sine squared. You might not have needed this step. Look at that. Cosine squared over sine squared is cotangent squared, and there we are. Ta-da! The end. Okay, if you went the other way, we're at about 18 minutes. We're getting a little bit long. It's just basically the reverse. Okay, you'd separate the other side out. Cosine squared times cosine squared over sine squared. Okay, and then you would change one of the cosine squareds to 1 minus sine squared. Then you would multiply it out. Then you would separate them out. You'd cancel out your sine squareds over here. And your cosine squared over sine squared would be cotangent squared on the left. And you'd have it. Okay, so there it is, folks. The whole practice quiz. All right, hopefully you find this helpful. Let me know if you need anything. You'll get this as an email as well. Thanks a lot. We'll see you later.